Hello everyone, my name is Max, and in our group we had Otis, Noah, and Micah. In this experiment, we explored stoichiometry through a hands-on chemical reaction. Stoichiometry is the study of quantitative relationships between amounts of reactants used and products formed by a chemical reaction. It is based on the law of conservation of mass, which states that matter can neither be created nor destroyed by a chemical reaction. The objective is to determine the limiting reagent at different ratios as we observe the reaction between two aqueous solutions, copper sulfate and potassium hydroxide.
The limiting reactant is the reactant that runs out first, which limits the amount of products made. An example is for every pair of shoes, there needs to be one Mr. Mitchell. The reactants are the shoes and Mr. Mitchell, which creates the product of Mr. Mitchell with shoes. If there are 4 pairs of shoes and 2 Mr. Mitchells, then they create 2 products of Mr. Mitchell with shoes. 2 pairs of shoes were not used, so that means they're the excess reactant. This means that Mr. Mitchell's the limiting reactant.
In our lab, the materials that were given to us were 2 burettes, 8 test tubes, as well as solutions containing KOH and CuSO4. The burette is the one that was filled with the solutions. We fill one burette with 0.2 moles of KOH, which is a clear liquid with very similar appearance to plain water, and the other with 0.1 mole of CuSO4, which is a blue-tinted translucent liquid. The test tubes are critical to our conclusion, and are the tools that we use to contain the reaction, and the vessel that was used to hold the product.
We started by filling each test tube with 5 millimeters of copper sulfate. In test tube number 1, we added 1 millimeter of potassium hydroxide. In test tube number 2, we added 2 millimeters and so on and so forth until we had 8 millimeters, then added distilled water to each test tube so that all of them contained 13 millimeters of solution. We took time to stir the test tubes thoroughly.
The precipitate that formed in tubes 1 through 5 had an appearance similar to very fine blue-tinted sand, while the precipitate in tubes 6 through 8 had a brown color with a fluffy texture. The next step was to measure the height of the formed precipitate at the bottom of the test tube. When we went from test tube 1 to test tube 5, there was an increase of precipitate that had formed up until about test tube 6, where the precipitate seemed to have plateaued.
In test tubes 1 through 4, we say that the limiting reactant is KOH because if we look at what we added to each test tube, we had an increasing amount of KOH while the amount of CuSO4 stayed the same. This is telling us that KOH is controlling how much product is being produced. In test tubes 5 through 8, the limiting reactant is now CuSO4 because each test tube had 5 milliliters of it, causing the precipitate yield to stay relatively the same. There can be several sources of error in this reaction, including transfer error and measurement error.